In March 2018, a 34-year-old Uber driver named Marcus Williams vanished without a trace during what appeared to be a routine late-night pickup in downtown Seattle. His silver Honda Accord was discovered at 2:17 a.m. on a quiet industrial street, engine still running, driver's side door wide open, with his phone displaying an active ride request that had been accepted just hours earlier. But 4 years later, when Seattle police accidentally released previously sealed evidence due to a software glitch in their digital storage system, what investigators discovered in Marcus's dashcam footage would reveal a truth so disturbing that it would forever change how rideshare companies approach passenger verification and expose a criminal network that had been operating in plain sight across multiple states for years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Williams was one of Seattle's most reliable rideshare drivers for nearly 6 years because of his methodical dedication. Those who knew Marcus described a man whose entire approach to life reflected the same careful attention to detail that made passengers feel safe climbing into his car at all hours of the night. His sister Rebecca would later tell investigators that Marcus had always been the type of person who checked his oil every weekend, who kept emergency supplies in his trunk, and who never failed to call their elderly mother every Sunday evening. At exactly 7 o'clock, Marcus had started driving for Uber in 2012, back when the service was still relatively new and the streets of Seattle felt different, safer somehow. He'd been working as a warehouse supervisor at the time, but the flexibility of rideshare driving had appealed to him, especially after their father's stroke left the family needing someone who could adjust their schedule for medical appointments and home care responsibilities. What began as supplemental income had gradually become Marcus's primary source of livelihood, and he'd embraced the role with characteristic thoroughness. His passengers consistently rated him 5 stars, not just for his careful driving or his clean car, but for something harder to quantify. Marcus had a way of reading people, of knowing when someone needed conversation and when they preferred silence. Late-night riders, particularly women traveling alone, often requested him specifically through Uber's driver preference system. He kept bottles of water in his car, phone chargers for different devices, and small packages of tissues. During Seattle's long winter months, he'd warm up his car several minutes before each pickup, ensuring passengers never had to slide into a cold seat. The rideshare industry had changed significantly during Marcus's 6 years behind the wheel. What once felt like a community of drivers who knew each other at airport pickup zones and downtown waiting areas had evolved into something more anonymous, more corporate. Safety features had been added, background checks had become more stringent, and both drivers and passengers had access to real-time tracking and emergency buttons. But for Marcus, these changes felt reassuring rather than restrictive. He'd always believed that the more safeguards in place, the better for everyone involved. By March 2018, Marcus had completed over 8,000 rides without a single serious incident. His daily routine had become almost ritualistic in its consistency. He'd begin driving at 6 p.m., focusing on the dinner rush and early evening airport runs. Around 9 p.m., he'd take a break for coffee and a sandwich, usually at the same diner near Pike Place Market where the owner, Mrs. Chun, had gotten to know him well enough to have his order ready before he walked through the door. Then he'd drive until around 2 a.m., handling the late-night crowd, bar closures, and airport pickups from delayed flights. This schedule allowed Marcus to be home by 2:30 a.m. most nights, giving him time to unwind before sleeping until late morning. He'd spend his afternoons handling family responsibilities, maintaining his car, and preparing for the evening shift. It was a life that might have seemed monotonous to some, but Marcus found satisfaction in the predictability, in knowing that his work directly helped people get where they needed to go safely. His family had grown accustomed to this routine as well. Rebecca knew that if she didn't hear from Marcus by 3 a.m., something was wrong. Their mother, despite her grief over losing her husband, had found comfort in Marcus's reliable schedule. She'd often wait up until he texted her that he was home, safe, a small ritual that helped her sleep peacefully. The night of March 15, 2018, began like thousands of others. Marcus had finished his dinner break at Mrs. Chin's diner, where she'd noted later that he seemed in particularly good spirits. He'd mentioned that spring was finally arriving in Seattle, that the tourists would be returning soon, and that he was looking forward to the increased business that warmer weather typically brought. He'd left the diner at 9:43 p.m., his usual time, and had immediately received a ride request from someone heading to Seattle-Tacoma Airport. The airport run was routine, a business traveler catching a red-eye flight to Chicago. Marcus had handled hundreds of similar rides, and this one proceeded exactly as expected. Professional passenger, minimal conversation, appropriate tip through the app. He dropped off the traveler at 10:52 p.m. and had positioned himself in the airport queue for another fare. The queue was unusually short for a Thursday night, and within 20 minutes, Marcus had picked up another passenger, this one heading to a hotel downtown. That second ride had also proceeded normally. A woman in her 30s, visiting Seattle for a conference, chatting pleasantly about the city's restaurant recommendations. Marcus had dropped her off at 11:38 p.m. outside the Grand Hyatt, where she'd thanked him and commented on how clean and comfortable his car was. It was the kind of interaction that reminded Marcus why he enjoyed his work, the brief but genuine human connections that made each night feel meaningful. At 11:45 p.m., while Marcus was stopped at a red light 2 blocks from the hotel, his phone chimed with another ride request. This was normal for a Thursday night in downtown Seattle. The bars weren't quite ready to close, but there was steady demand from people finishing dinner, ending dates, or heading home from evening events. Marcus glanced at his phone and saw a pickup location just 6 blocks away, with a destination listed as an address in the industrial district south of downtown. The passenger's name showed as David K., with a profile photo showing a middle-aged man in what appeared to be a professional headshot. The destination address wasn't familiar to Marcus, but that wasn't unusual. Seattle's industrial areas included many businesses, warehouses, and even some residential lofts that drivers might not know by heart. The estimated fare was reasonable for the distance, and the pickup location was easily accessible. Marcus accepted the ride request and began driving toward the designated pickup point, a street corner near a cluster of restaurants and late-night establishments. He'd pulled up to the specified location at 11:51 p.m., and according to his phone's GPS data, had remained stationary there for approximately 4 minutes. Then, at 11:55 p.m., his phone showed movement toward the destination address, indicating that he'd picked up his passenger and begun the ride. This was where the digital trail of Marcus Williams's final night became frustratingly incomplete. His phone's GPS showed the car moving along a logical route toward the destination address, traveling at normal speeds through downtown Seattle and into the industrial district. The last GPS ping was recorded at 12:23 a.m., showing the vehicle stopped at the intersection of Harbor Avenue and Southwest Spokane Street, approximately 2 miles from the intended destination. What happened in the next hour and 54 minutes remained a mystery that would consume investigators for months. Marcus's phone went silent after that final GPS ping, and his car's location became unknown until a Seattle Police Patrol unit discovered it at 2:17 a.m. on a quiet industrial street. Engine running, driver's door open, with no sign of Marcus or his passenger anywhere nearby. The discovery of the abandoned vehicle marked the beginning of one of Seattle's most perplexing missing person cases. Officer Jennifer Martinez, who was first on the scene, would later describe the unsettling nature of what she found. The car showed no signs of struggle, no blood, no damage. Marcus's phone was still in the cup holder, still showing the active ride request. His wallet was in his jacket pocket, containing his driver's license, credit cards, and $83 in cash. His keys were still in the ignition. What struck Officer Martinez as particularly strange was how intentional everything appeared. The car wasn't haphazardly abandoned or left in a way that suggested panic or violence. It was parked legally at a curb, hazard lights off, passenger door closed, driver's door standing wide open as if someone had simply stepped out and walked away. Even Marcus's coffee cup was still in the center console, half full and still warm. The immediate area around the abandoned car offered few clues. The industrial street was lined with warehouses and shipping facilities, most of which were closed and secured for the night. A few businesses had security cameras, but their angles and range didn't capture the specific location where Marcus's car was found. The nearest traffic camera was 3 blocks away. And while it would eventually provide some useful footage, it couldn't answer the central question of what had happened to Marcus and his passenger. Seattle police immediately began treating the case as a potential abduction, given the unusual circumstances and the fact that Marcus had simply vanished from his vehicle. Detective Sarah Chun, who was assigned as the lead investigator, had handled numerous missing person cases during her 12 years with the department, but she'd never encountered a situation quite like this one. The complete absence of physical evidence, combined with the almost ritualistic way the car had been left, suggested something far more complex than a random crime. The first 48 hours of the investigation focused on the most obvious possibilities. Had Marcus encountered a passenger who intended to rob him? Had he been carjacked in a particularly unusual way? Was there any chance he'd simply decided to abandon his car and disappear voluntarily? Detective Chen's team interviewed Marcus's family, friends, and regular passengers, trying to construct a picture of his state of mind and whether there were any factors that might explain a voluntary disappearance. Every interview painted the same picture of Marcus Williams. He was reliable, responsible, devoted to his family, and showed no signs of distress or desire to escape his life. Rebecca provided investigators with detailed information about Marcus's financial situation, which was stable, his relationships, which were positive, and his future plans, which included helping their mother renovate her kitchen that summer. There was simply no indication that Marcus had any reason to voluntarily disappear. The investigation then turned to the rideshare angle, which presented its own set of challenges. Uber's safety team immediately cooperated with police, providing detailed information about Marcus's account, his ride history, and the final ride request that had led to his disappearance. The passenger information for David K. included a phone number and an email address, both of which were quickly determined to be inactive. The profile had been created just 2 weeks before the ride request, with minimal verification information. This discovery raised immediate red flags for investigators. While it wasn't unusual for passengers to create new accounts, the timing seemed suspicious, and the lack of additional ride history suggested the account might have been created specifically for this purpose. Uber's safety team ran additional background checks on the account creation, but the information provided during registration appeared to be fabricated. The email address used fake credentials, and the phone number led to a prepaid device that had been purchased with cash and never used for any other services. As the investigation expanded, Detective Chen's team began reaching out to other rideshare companies, taxi services, and transportation providers throughout the Pacific Northwest. They were looking for similar incidents, cases where drivers had disappeared under unusual circumstances, or patterns that might suggest Marcus's case wasn't isolated. This broader investigation would eventually yield disturbing results, but in those first weeks, it primarily highlighted how unusual Marcus's disappearance truly was. The search efforts were extensive and thorough. Seattle police organized ground searches of the industrial area where Marcus's car was found, using K-9 units and volunteers to cover warehouses, waterfront areas, and undeveloped lots. Marine units searched portions of Elliott Bay, operating on the theory that if Marcus had been harmed, his body might have been disposed of in the water. Missing person flyers were distributed throughout the city, and local media coverage generated hundreds of tips from citizens who thought they might have seen Marcus or his passenger. Each lead was investigated carefully, but none provided substantial progress. Several people reported seeing a silver Honda Accord in various locations around the time of Marcus's disappearance, but none of these sightings could be definitively connected to his vehicle. A few callers claimed to have seen a man matching Marcus's description in different parts of the city, but follow-up investigations revealed these to be cases of mistaken identity. The case began to generate significant media attention, particularly within Seattle's rideshare driver community. Many drivers were understandably concerned about their own safety, and several organized informal safety meetings to discuss the incident and share precautionary strategies. The story also caught the attention of national news outlets, partly because of the unusual circumstances and partly because it highlighted broader questions about rideshare safety for both drivers and passengers. Marcus's family became increasingly desperate as days turned into weeks with no substantial progress. Rebecca took leave from her job as a nurse to dedicate herself to search efforts, creating social media campaigns, and organizing volunteer search groups. She set up a command center in her home, coordinating with police while maintaining her own parallel investigation into her brother's disappearance. The family hired a private investigator, David Restrepo, who had experience with missing person cases and a reputation for persistence in difficult investigations. Restrepo's approach complemented the police investigation by focusing on areas that official channels might not be able to pursue as aggressively. He spent considerable time interviewing other rideshare drivers, looking for patterns or incidents that might not have been reported to police but could be relevant to Marcus's case. 1 month after Marcus's disappearance, the investigation reached what felt like a dead end. Police had followed every lead, interviewed dozens of people, searched countless locations, and coordinated with federal agencies to determine if the case might involve interstate crime. Despite these efforts, they were no closer to understanding what had happened to Marcus Williams on that March night. Detective Chen remained committed to the case, but she was also realistic about the challenges they faced. Without physical evidence, witnesses, or additional incidents to provide context, the investigation had stalled. The case remained active, with periodic reviews and follow-ups on any new information, but the daily intensive investigation had necessarily been scaled back as other urgent cases demanded attention. For Marcus's family, this scaling back felt like abandonment, though they understood the practical limitations facing the police department. Rebecca continued her own search efforts, maintaining the social media campaigns and regularly contacting local media to keep Marcus's story in the public consciousness. She also began researching other missing person cases, looking for patterns or similarities that might provide new avenues for investigation. The first year after Marcus's disappearance was particularly difficult for his mother, Eleanor Williams. Already grieving her husband's death and adjusting to life as a widow, the loss of Marcus felt overwhelming. She struggled with the uncertainty, the not knowing whether her son was alive or dead, whether he was suffering somewhere or had died. Quickly, Rebecca moved in with her mother during this period, providing both practical support and emotional companionship during the darkest months. Eleanor had always been a woman of strong faith, but Marcus's disappearance tested her beliefs in ways she'd never experienced. She attended church regularly, participated in prayer groups focused on missing persons, and found some comfort in the support of her religious community. But the questions remained, gnawing at her peace and making sleep difficult. She kept Marcus's room exactly as he'd left it, his clothes still in the closet, his books still on the nightstand, as if maintaining this shrine might somehow bring him home. As 2018 turned into 2019, the case evolved from an active investigation into what police departments call a cold case, though Detective Chun made sure it never became truly cold. She reviewed the file monthly, followed up on any new information, and maintained contact with Marcus's family to ensure they knew the case hadn't been forgotten. She also coordinated with other jurisdictions when similar cases emerged, looking for connections that might shed new light on Marcus's disappearance. The second year brought some renewed hope when a body was discovered in Puget Sound that briefly seemed like it might be Marcus. The remains were badly decomposed, found by a fisherman near Vashon Island, and initially appeared to match Marcus's physical description. For 3 agonizing days, the Williams family waited for forensic confirmation, preparing themselves for the possibility that their uncertainty might finally end, even if the news was devastating. But DNA analysis revealed that the remains belonged to someone else entirely, a homeless man who had been missing for nearly a year. While this provided closure for another family, it left the Williams family back in the same painful limbo they'd been experiencing for months. Rebecca later described those 3 days of waiting as among the worst of the entire ordeal, because for the first time, she'd allowed herself to imagine that not knowing was worse than knowing, only to discover that the uncertainty would continue indefinitely. The rideshare industry had changed significantly in the wake of Marcus's disappearance and similar incidents across the country. Uber and other companies implemented additional safety features, including more robust identity verification for passengers, enhanced GPS tracking, and emergency assistance features that could be activated by both drivers and passengers. While these changes were welcomed by drivers and their families, fabricated destination addresses, and the complete disappearance of both driver and passenger federal investigators began to suspect that these disappearances were connected to human trafficking operations that were using rideshare platforms to recruit and transport both victims and operators. The sophisticated nature of the fake profiles, the careful selection of isolated destination addresses, and the organized disposal of evidence suggested a criminal network with significant resources and coordination across multiple jurisdictions. By late 2022, the joint investigation had identified more than 30 similar cases across 12 states, involving drivers who had disappeared under circumstances remarkably similar to Marcus's case. The pattern suggested that drivers were being lured to isolated locations where they were either killed or forced into participating in illegal transportation networks that moved human trafficking victims across state lines. The emotional toll on Marcus's family during this period was immense. Rebecca Williams had maintained hope for 4 years that her brother might still be alive, that he might have been kidnapped and could potentially be rescued. But as the investigation revealed the likely criminal network involved and the pattern of similar disappearances, the probability that Marcus was still alive diminished significantly. Eleanor Williams, now 73 years old and in declining health, struggled to process the new information about her son's case. The possibility that Marcus had been murdered was devastating, but the uncertainty about his fate continued to prevent any sense of closure or resolution. She began experiencing health problems that her doctors attributed partly to the prolonged stress of not knowing what had happened to her. As 2022 turned into 2023, the investigation had identified several suspects and was building cases against what appeared to be a coordinated criminal network operating across multiple states. Search warrants were executed at locations in Washington, Oregon, and California, yielding evidence of sophisticated identity theft operations, fake document production, and financial records suggesting extensive human trafficking activities. However, despite these investigative successes, the specific fate of Marcus Williams remained unknown. The criminal network appeared to have been operating for several years before his disappearance and continued operating for some time afterward, making it difficult to determine exactly what had happened to individual victims. Federal prosecutors were preparing cases against the identified suspects, but these legal proceedings would likely take months or years to complete. The Williams family was kept informed of investigation developments, but the progress felt both hopeful and frustrating. They were grateful that law enforcement was finally making progress on Marcus's case, but they remained desperate for specific information about what had happened to him and where his remains might be located. Rebecca continued advocating for missing persons' families and working with various organizations to improve safety protections for rideshare drivers. In early 2023, federal agents made their first major arrests in connection with the trafficking network, taking into custody 5 individuals in coordinated raids across 3 states. The arrested suspects included people who had been creating fake rideshare passenger profiles, individuals responsible for recruiting and transporting victims, and organizers who coordinated the network's activities across multiple jurisdictions. During interrogations following these arrests, some suspects began providing information about the network's operations, including details about how drivers like Marcus were selected, lured to isolated locations, and either recruited or eliminated depending on their perceived usefulness to the organization. The information was difficult for law enforcement to verify and even more difficult for victims' families to hear, but it provided the first concrete details about what might have happened during Marcus's final hours, according to suspect statements. Drivers were typically targeted based on their schedules, routes, and perceived reliability. Marcus's consistent late-night driving patterns, his familiarity with Seattle's industrial areas, and his reputation for accepting difficult or unusual rides had made him an attractive target for recruitment into the trafficking network's transportation operations. The fake passenger profile and fabricated destination address were designed to get him to an isolated location where he could be approached by network operatives. What happened next, according to the suspect information, depended on the driver's response to recruitment efforts. Drivers who agreed to participate in transporting trafficking victims were compensated significantly more than they could earn through legitimate rideshare work, but they were also threatened with violence if they attempted to leave the network or report its activities to law enforcement. Drivers who refused to participate or who were perceived as likely to report the network to authorities, were eliminated to protect the organization's security. The suspect's statements suggested that Marcus had likely refused to participate in the trafficking network, leading to his murder and the disposal of his body in a location that would prevent discovery and identification. However, the suspects either didn't know or wouldn't reveal specific details about where Marcus's remains had been disposed of, leaving his family without the closure they desperately needed. As the federal prosecution of the trafficking network proceeded through 2023, additional arrests were made and more information emerged about the scope of the criminal operation. The network had been operating for at least 8 years, had moved hundreds of trafficking victims across multiple states, and had eliminated dozens of transportation workers who had refused to participate or were perceived as security threats. The investigation also revealed the sophisticated methods the network used to avoid detection. They regularly changed their operational areas, used advanced technology to create convincing fake identities, and maintained strict compartmentalization, so that individual operatives knew only what was necessary for their specific roles. The network had also infiltrated some legitimate transportation companies and had corrupted officials in various jurisdictions to avoid law enforcement attention. For the Williams family, the federal investigation provided some answers, but also raised new questions. They now understood that Marcus had likely been targeted specifically because of his reliability and route patterns, and they knew that his disappearance was part of a much larger criminal operation. But they still didn't know exactly where or how he had died, and they didn't have his remains to bury and memorialize properly. Rebecca Williams began working with other families affected by the trafficking network, finding some comfort in shared experiences and mutual support. She also became involved in advocacy efforts aimed at improving safety protections for transportation workers and better coordination between law enforcement agencies investigating human trafficking cases. Eleanor Williams's health continued to decline during this period, and her doctors recommended that the family consider hospice care. She remained mentally sharp and emotionally engaged with the investigation developments, but the physical toll of 4 years of uncertainty and grief had weakened her significantly. She expressed to Rebecca that her greatest wish was to know where Marcus was buried so that she could visit his grave and properly say goodbye. In late 2023, federal prosecutors achieved a significant breakthrough when one of the arrested network organizers agreed to cooperate with law enforcement in exchange for a reduced sentence. This individual, facing life imprisonment without parole, provided detailed information about the network's operations, including specific locations where victims had been disposed of and detailed descriptions of individual cases. According to this cooperating witness, Marcus Williams had been transported from the initial pickup location to a warehouse facility in the industrial district, where network operatives had attempted to recruit him into their transportation operations. When Marcus refused and indicated that he planned to report the incident to police, he was killed and his body was disposed of in a location approximately 60 miles south of Seattle, in a remote forested area near Mount Rainier National Park. The cooperating witness provided specific coordinates and detailed directions to the disposal location, information that was immediately shared with search and recovery teams. However, the witness also indicated that Marcus's body had been disposed of more than 5 years earlier, meaning that recovery efforts would be challenging and that any remains would likely be significantly decomposed. Search teams, including K-9 units trained in human remains detection, began systematic searches of the area identified by the cooperating witness in early 2024. The terrain was difficult, heavily forested and mountainous, with multiple ravines and water features that could have concealed remains. Weather conditions were also challenging, with persistent rain and snow that hampered search efforts. After 3 weeks of intensive searching, recovery teams located what appeared to be human remains in a ravine approximately 2 miles from the coordinates provided by the cooperating witness. The remains were badly decomposed and scattered, consistent with having been exposed to natural elements for several years. Forensic anthropologists were brought in to carefully excavate and document the remains, which were then transported to the medical examiner's office for analysis. DNA analysis confirmed that the remains belonged to Marcus Williams, finally providing the definitive answer that his family had been seeking for nearly 6 years. The medical examiner determined that Marcus had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck with a heavy object. The manner of death was ruled a homicide, and the remains showed no evidence of defensive wounds, suggesting that Marcus had been killed quickly, possibly without warning. For the Williams family, the recovery of Marcus's remains brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. They finally had answers about what had happened to him, and they could proceed with funeral arrangements and burial plans that had been postponed for years. But they also had to confront the reality of Marcus's violent death and the suffering he might have experienced in his final hours. Eleanor Williams, despite her declining health, was able to participate in planning Marcus's funeral services. She chose a burial plot next to her husband's grave, fulfilling her wish to have her family together in death, even though they had been separated by tragedy in life. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including many rideshare drivers who had known Marcus, passengers who remembered him fondly, and law enforcement officers who had worked on his case. The federal prosecution of the human trafficking network continued throughout 2024, with additional arrests and prosecutions as investigators unraveled the full scope of the criminal operation. Several network organizers were sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, while lower-level operatives received sentences ranging from 20 to 40 years. The cooperating witness who had provided information about Marcus's location received a reduced sentence of 30 years in federal prison. The investigation also led to significant changes in rideshare industry safety protocols, including enhanced identity verification for passengers, improved GPS tracking and emergency communication systems, and better coordination with law enforcement agencies investigating transportation-related crimes. While these changes couldn't prevent every possible incident, they represented meaningful improvements in safety protections for drivers like Marcus. Rebecca Williams became a prominent advocate for transportation worker safety and missing persons families, using her experience with Marcus's case to help other families navigate similar ordeals. She established a foundation in Marcus's memory that provided support services for families of missing transportation workers and funded safety improvements for rideshare and taxi drivers. Eleanor Williams passed away peacefully in her sleep in August 2024, 5 months after Marcus's funeral. Rebecca found some comfort in knowing that her mother had lived to see Marcus's remains recovered and properly buried, achieving the closure she had sought for so many years. Eleanor was buried next to her husband and son, reuniting the family in death as they had been in life. The Marcus Williams case became a landmark in law enforcement approaches to human trafficking investigations, demonstrating the importance of advanced forensic techniques, multi-jurisdictional cooperation, and persistent investigation of cold cases. The enhanced dashcam footage that had provided the crucial breakthrough became a model for how technological improvements could breathe new life into stalled investigations. For the broader rideshare driver community, Marcus's case served as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. His death highlighted the real dangers that drivers could face, but his family's persistent advocacy and the law enforcement community's determination to solve his case demonstrated that drivers' lives were valued and that their safety was a priority worth fighting for. The criminal network responsible for Marcus's death and the deaths of dozens of other transportation workers was ultimately dismantled, but the investigation revealed the ongoing threat that human trafficking operations pose to both drivers and passengers. The case underscored the need for continued vigilance, improved safety protocols, and ongoing cooperation between rideshare companies, law enforcement agencies, and the communities they served. Rebecca Williams continued her advocacy work, speaking at conferences and training sessions for law enforcement officers, rideshare company executives, and driver safety organizations. She often began her presentations by showing a photograph of Marcus in his car, smiling and giving a thumbs up after completing his 5,000th ride. She would tell audiences that Marcus had loved his work and had trusted in the systems designed to keep him safe, and that his death represented a failure of those systems that could never be allowed to happen again. The enhanced dashcam footage that had broken open Marcus's case was eventually used to solve several other missing person cases, demonstrating the value of preserving evidence and regularly reviewing cold cases with improved technology. The software glitch that had accidentally made the footage accessible was ultimately seen as a fortunate accident that had led to justice for Marcus and many other victims. As 2024 drew to a close, Rebecca Williams reflected on the 6-year journey. From Marcus's disappearance to the resolution of his case. The pain of losing her brother would never fully heal, and the knowledge of how he had died would always be difficult to bear. But she found meaning in the changes that had resulted from his case, the other families who had achieved closure through the investigation, and the improvements in safety that might prevent future tragedies. The last entry in Detective Chen's case file noted that Marcus Williams had been laid to rest with full honors, surrounded by family, friends, and colleagues who remembered him as a dedicated driver, loving son and brother, and good man who had simply been trying to help someone get home safely on a cold March night in 2018. His death had revealed a criminal network that might have continued operating indefinitely without his unwitting sacrifice, and his family's persistence in seeking answers had ultimately led to justice for dozens of victims. Marcus Williams's silver Honda Accord, which had been preserved as evidence throughout the investigation, was eventually returned to his family and donated to a vocational training program that taught automotive repair skills to at-risk youth. Rebecca thought Marcus would have appreciated knowing that his car, which had been his partner in so many late-night journeys around Seattle, would continue serving others in a new capacity, the intersection where Marcus's car had been found abandoned. That night was eventually renamed Marcus Williams Way, a small tribute that ensured his name would be remembered by future generations of Seattle residents. A small memorial plaque was installed nearby, noting that Marcus had died in service to his community and that his sacrifice had led to important improvements in transportation worker safety. In the end, Marcus Williams's story became one of tragedy, transformed into purpose, of a family's love and persistence overcoming systemic failures, and of a community's determination to protect those who served it. His death had revealed horrors that most people never imagined, but it had also demonstrated the power of human determination to seek truth and justice even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The case file was finally closed in December 2024, nearly 7 years after Marcus Williams had accepted what he thought was a routine ride request on a quiet Thursday night in downtown Seattle. But his legacy lived on in the safety improvements that protected other drivers, the criminal network that had been dismantled, the families who had achieved closure, and the knowledge that sometimes the most ordinary act of service, helping someone get home safely, could ultimately serve the cause of justice in ways that no one could have foreseen.